It's 7 in the morning, and before you even fully open your eyes, you already feel that familiar weight settling in your chest. It's not physical, although your body seems to have aged 10 years during the night. It's something deeper, a sensation that you should be doing something, being someone different, living in a way you can't even properly define. You haven't even gotten out of bed yet, and you already feel late for a life you don't even know if it's really yours. It's as if there's an invisible voice constantly whispering that you're not being enough, that you're disappointing people who might not even exist, that each breath is a waste of oxygen that someone more deserving could be using. Franz Kafka intimately knew this fatigue that doesn't come from effort, but from the constant sensation of inadequacy. He once wrote, "I feel lost, like a strange object placed in a place where it doesn't belong." Perhaps this is the most precise description of what it means to wake up already feeling guilty for existing. There's a brutal difference between being physically tired and being existentially exhausted. When you're physically tired, sleep fixes it. But when your soul is tired from carrying a weight you don't even know where it comes from, sleeping 20 hours straight doesn't relieve anything. It's like you're a defendant in a courtroom where they never told you what crime you committed, where there was never a trial, but where the sentence was given long ago. Do you know this feeling of constantly living on the defensive, as if you needed to justify occupying space in the world? As if every choice you make were evidence of some fundamental flaw you carry. Marina, a friend I met a few years ago, told me she would wake up every day mentally apologizing to life. She didn't know why she was apologizing. She just felt she owed this to the universe, as if her existence were an inconvenience that needed to be constantly minimized. For months, she lived as if she were an intruder in her own life, tiptoeing in her own house, speaking softly in her own conversations, occupying the smallest possible space in her own body. Existential guilt doesn't ask permission to enter your life. It simply settles in as if it had always lived there. It's different from the guilt you feel when you do something specifically wrong, that at least has an origin, has the right address. Existential guilt is like an emotional virus that infects every aspect of your existence. You feel guilty for being happy when others are suffering, guilty for being sad when you should be grateful, guilty for wanting more when you already have so much, guilty for not wanting enough when you should be more ambitious. It's a circular guilt without beginning or end that feeds on itself and grows every day. Kafka understood this emotional trap when he wrote in his letters that he felt like an eternally hungry man before an always set table, but unable to extend his hand. This hunger wasn't for food, but for an absolution he himself didn't know how to grant himself. The most perverse thing about this existential guilt is how it disguises itself as responsibility. Our culture glorifies guilt as if it were synonymous with conscience, as if feeling guilty were proof that you're a good person, concerned, responsible. How many times have you heard someone say, "At least you care," when you express guilt about something? This social validation of guilt creates a psychological trap where you begin to believe that feeling guilty is a virtue, that it's better to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders than to risk being selfish. But there's an abyssal difference between healthy responsibility and toxic guilt. Responsibility moves you to action, gives you clarity about what you can control and what you must accept. Guilt paralyzes you, leaves you spinning in mental circles where you eternally punish yourself for things that have already happened or might happen. Daniel, a 30-year-old guy who works in technology, told me he spent an entire decade of his life feeling guilty for not calling his parents enough, even though he called them 3 times a week. The guilt had no basis in reality, but it had become his constant companion, a familiar presence he could almost no longer imagine living without. Kafka had a very complicated relationship with guilt, especially with his father. His letters reveal a man tormented by the sensation of never being enough, of always disappointing the expectations of those he loved. He wrote about feeling like a parasite in the paternal house, even though he was an independent adult and a brilliant writer. This filial guilt expanded to all aspects of his life, creating a constant sensation of inadequacy that showed through in his works. The protagonist of the trial is accused of a crime that is never revealed, judged by laws that are never explained, in a court that never offers clarity. It's the perfect representation of how someone living under the weight of existential guilt feels. Always a defendant, never knowing exactly what they're accused of, but convinced they deserve whatever punishment comes. Kafka's genius was managing to transform his personal pain into a universal metaphor that resonates with anyone who has ever felt guilty for simply existing. The deepest question about this existential guilt is that it often has no origin in something you did or failed to do. Sometimes it's born in childhood, when you absorb subtle messages that your joy bothers others, that your needs are a burden, that you should be grateful and silent. Other times, it emerges from a world that seems constantly in crisis, where existing without doing something grandiose to save the planet seems morally questionable. We live in an era where we're bombarded daily with information about all the world's injustices, all the causes that need our attention, all the groups that need our help. It's humanly impossible to carry the weight of all this responsibility, but our hyper-connected conscience doesn't understand limits. You feel guilty for buying coffee, while there are people going hungry, guilty for complaining about work, while there are unemployed people, guilty for having emotional problems while there are people facing real tragedies. This comparative guilt is a prison where you never have permission to feel what you're feeling, to live the life you're living. There's also temporal guilt, this sensation that you're wasting the time you have on earth. How many times have you caught yourself feeling guilty for watching a movie, for talking with friends, for not producing something useful every minute of your day? Our society has sold the idea that every moment must be optimized. Every minute must contribute to some greater goal, as if relaxing were a crime against productivity. Kafka fought against this pressure throughout his life. He worked at an insurance company during the day and wrote at night, always feeling guilty for not dedicating enough time to writing, but also feeling guilty for dreaming of a different life when he had a stable job. This internal war between what you do and what you'd like to do, between your responsibilities and your dreams, creates a constant guilt that never leaves you in peace. You feel guilty for working too much and missing precious moments with those you love, but you also feel guilty for valuing relationships when you should be building a solid career. Existential guilt has a toxic relationship with perfectionism. When you believe, even unconsciously, that you need to be perfect to deserve to exist without guilt, every mistake becomes evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. You begin to live as if you were constantly being evaluated by invisible judges who always find flaws in your performance. Mariana, a 40-year-old teacher, told me that for a long time she felt guilty for not being the best at everything she did. She couldn't simply be good at what she did. She needed to be exceptional. Otherwise, she felt like she was stealing opportunities from more talented people. This need for perfection created constant pressure that transformed every day into a test she never completely passed. Perfectionism masked as guilt is especially cruel because it disguises itself as humility, when in reality it's a form of inverted arrogance, the belief that you should be capable of controlling and executing everything perfectly. Pause here for a moment. Have you ever felt like you were living with an invisible weight in your chest, a constant sensation that you should be doing something different, being someone different, living in a way you never managed to define properly? This guilt that has no right address, but that lives inside you as if it were your oldest companion. I know you have. because you wouldn't be here if you didn't recognize this feeling of waking up already feeling late for a life you don't know if it's yours. If you've ever lived this fatigue that doesn't pass with rest, write in the comments just, "I carry it too." You don't need to explain anything else, just these 4 words. Because when you admit this, you're telling another person who feels this way that they're not crazy, that this weight is real, and that you both aren't alone in this fight against ghosts that seem all too real. Existential guilt has a peculiar way of distorting our relationship with pleasure and joy. When you get used to feeling guilty for existing, any moment of genuine happiness seems suspicious, as if you don't deserve to feel good while the world carries so much suffering. It's as if you've internalized the belief that joy is a luxury that people like you can't afford. Kafka wrote in his diary that happiness doesn't exist, only the absence of unhappiness, revealing how his existential guilt had killed his ability to allow himself moments of true lightness. Many people who carry this guilt develop what psychologists call survivor syndrome, where they feel guilty for being well when others aren't, for having opportunities when others don't, for simply existing when others have departed. This guilt steals your ability to celebrate achievements, to enjoy simple moments, to allow yourself to be human. What hurts most about existential guilt is how it contaminates your relationships. When you fundamentally believe you're a burden, you relate to people as if you were constantly apologizing for occupying space in their lives. You become excessively compliant, always saying yes when you'd like to say no, always putting others' needs before yours, not because you're generous, but because you believe your needs are less valid. This creates unbalanced relationships where you transform into a smaller version of yourself, always shrinking to fit into the space you think you deserve. Roberto, a 50-year-old man, told me he spent decades apologizing for existing in relationships, always feeling like he was bothering when he expressed an opinion, always feeling guilty for having emotional needs. He had learned since childhood that his presence was tolerated, not celebrated, and he carried this belief into all his adult relationships. Liberation from existential guilt doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process of recognizing that you have the right to occupy space in the world without constantly justifying yourself. It means understanding that your existence isn't a cosmic accident that needs to be compensated for, but a fact that can be accepted with neutrality, and maybe, eventually, with gratitude. Kafka, despite all his internal struggle, managed to transform his pain into art that still today helps people feel less alone in their own existential struggles. His words are proof that even someone who carried such deep guilt managed to create something of lasting value. Maybe the cure for existential guilt isn't the total absence of questioning, but the ability to question without destroying yourself in the process. Accepting that you deserve to exist without guilt is a revolutionary act in a world that profits from your personal dissatisfaction. It's deciding that you don't need to diminish yourself so others feel bigger, that you don't need to carry pains that aren't yours, that you don't need to live apologizing for occupying the space that naturally belongs to you. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or insensitive to others' suffering. It means recognizing that you can only genuinely contribute to the world when you stop draining your own energy with imaginary guilt. When you free yourself from existential guilt, you discover you have much more energy and true compassion to offer, because you're no longer spending all your emotional strength punishing yourself for crimes you never committed. The journey to escape existential guilt requires you to develop a completely new relationship with yourself, one where you're the defense attorney of your own life, not the prosecutor who always finds evidence for your condemnation. It means learning to question these automatic thoughts that assume your guilt as a starting point. When your mind whispers that you shouldn't be feeling good, you can ask, according to whom? When it says you're wasting time, you can question, wasting according to what standard? Kafka never completely escaped his existential guilt, but he left a legacy that teaches us that our pain can have purpose, that our deepest questions can be transformed into bridges for human understanding. The most ironic thing about existential guilt is that the people who carry it most are often those who have the least reason to feel guilty. They're sensitive, aware people who genuinely care about the impact they have on the world. This very sensitivity, which is a beautiful quality, transforms into a weapon against themselves when there are no healthy boundaries. If you recognized yourself in these words, know that your ability to feel deeply is a gift, not a curse. The problem was never you being too sensitive. The problem is a world that didn't know how to value and protect this sensitivity. Your guilt doesn't prove you're a bad person. It proves exactly the opposite, that you care so much you're willing to carry weights that aren't even yours. There's a simple but powerful exercise that can help you begin this journey of liberation. Every morning before getting out of bed, spend a few minutes breathing consciously and asking yourself, what exactly do I feel guilty about today? Most of the time, you'll discover that the guilt is vague, without a specific address, like a dense cloud that obscures your vision but dissolves when you examine it closely. When you can identify a specific guilt, ask yourself, is this really my responsibility, or am I carrying something that belongs to another person, to the system, to society? You'll often discover you're punishing yourself for failures that aren't yours, for expectations you never consciously accepted, for impossible standards you internalized without questioning. Existential guilt also feeds on constant comparison. We live in an era of hyperexposure where you can compare your internal life with the carefully curated external life of millions of people on social media. You see others' edited joy and compare it with your unfiltered sadness. You see others' public achievements and compare them with your private struggles. This unfair comparison creates additional guilt. You feel guilty for not being at the same level as people who only show their best moments. Kafka lived in an era without social media, but faced his own version of this toxic comparison, always measuring himself against writers he considered superior, always feeling inadequate before standards he created to torture himself. One of the most liberating discoveries you can make is realizing that existential guilt is, frequently, a disguised form of pride. It may seem contradictory, but think about it. When you feel guilty for not saving the world, for not being perfect, for not managing to solve all the problems around you, you're inadvertently placing yourself in a position of power that might not be realistic. It's as if you considered yourself so important that your inability to fix everything was a grave moral failure. This perception doesn't diminish your compassion or social responsibility, but puts it in a healthier perspective. You can care deeply about the world without carrying the weight of fixing it alone. Helena, a 28-year-old nurse, shared with me how she discovered that her guilt for not being able to save all patients was actually stealing her energy to care well for those she could help. She had created a neurotic relationship with others' suffering, where she felt personally responsible for all the pain she witnessed. When she learned to distinguish between healthy compassion and toxic guilt, she paradoxically became a more efficient professional and a happier person. Healthy compassion moves you to action within your real limits. Toxic guilt paralyzes you with imaginary responsibilities that are beyond your human capacity. There's also the question of family emotional inheritance. Often we carry guilt that isn't even ours, but that was transmitted through generations like a silent emotional virus. Maybe your grandmother lived with guilt for surviving a war, and this guilt transformed into a hyper-responsibility that passed to your mother, who passed it to you. Maybe your father carried the guilt of not being the provider he believed he should be, and this sensation of inadequacy infiltrated your home's emotional atmosphere. Recognizing these emotional inheritances isn't a way to blame your ancestors, but to understand that you have the right to consciously choose which weights are worth carrying and which can be gently placed on the ground. Kafka had a particularly complicated relationship with this family inheritance. He grew up in a Jewish family in Prague, carrying not only his own insecurities, but the historical weight of a community that had been persecuted for centuries. His personal guilt intertwined with a collective guilt that seemed endless. In his letters, he frequently expresses the sensation of carrying sins he didn't commit, debts he didn't contract, responsibilities he inherited simply by existing. This collective dimension of guilt is especially relevant today, when we're constantly aware of historical and present injustices, when every purchase, every choice, every breath seems to carry political and moral weight. Modern media exponentially amplifies our existential guilt. We're bombarded daily with information about climate crises, social injustices, animal suffering, global poverty, and each piece of information carries an implicit demand. And you? What are you doing to solve this? It's a valid question in reasonable doses, but becomes toxic when applied to every aspect of human existence. You can't carry responsibility for global warming while brushing your teeth, can't solve world hunger while preparing your morning coffee, can't correct all historical injustices while deciding what clothes to wear. This hyper-awareness without clear limits of personal responsibility creates paralyzing existential guilt that, ironically, diminishes our capacity to contribute meaningfully to the causes that truly matter to us. Liberation from existential guilt also involves completely redefining your relationship with the concept of deserving. Our culture is obsessed with the idea that we need to deserve everything, deserve love, deserve success, deserve happiness, deserve even to exist. But who decides what you deserve? What are the criteria? Who's maintaining this cosmic accounting where your existential debits and credits are constantly calculated? When you really examine this idea of deserving, you discover it's largely an arbitrary social construction that serves more to control behaviors than to create a meaningful life. You don't need to deserve the air you breathe, the sun that shines on your skin, the possibility of loving and being loved. These are characteristics of human experience, not prizes you win for good behavior. Carlos, a 45-year-old businessman, told me he spent decades unconsciously sabotaging himself because he didn't believe he deserved the success he had achieved. He had grown up in a family where suffering was glorified as virtue, where enjoying life was seen as moral superficiality. This programming made him feel guilty every time things went well, as if he was stealing happiness from someone who deserved it more. Only when he began to actively question this belief was he able to relax in his own life and, paradoxically, became more generous and compassionate with others. When you stop spending energy feeling guilty for your blessings, there's more energy left to share them. Kafka wrote in one of his most touching letters, "I write so as not to go mad." Maybe this is the key to dealing with existential guilt, finding a form of expression, a channel for this energy that's being wasted in destructive self-criticism. It doesn't need to be writing. It can be art, music, conversation, volunteer work, anything that transforms the energy of guilt into creative or contributive energy. When you find a healthy way to channel your sensitivity and your sense of responsibility, guilt transforms into purpose. The same emotional intensity that once destroyed you can become the driving force to create something meaningful in the world. There's a profound difference between healthy regret and toxic guilt. Healthy regret teaches you, makes you grow, moves you to concrete changes, and then leaves. Toxic guilt settles in like an emotional parasite that feeds on itself, growing more and more without ever offering anything constructive in return. When you make a real mistake, regret tells you, learn from this and do differently next time. Existential guilt tells you, you are fundamentally flawed and should punish yourself eternally. Learning to recognize this difference is liberating, because it allows you to maintain your moral conscience without destroying yourself in the process. Remember also that your existential guilt might be protecting you from facing deeper fears. Sometimes it's easier to feel guilty than to admit you're afraid of not being loved, afraid of not being enough, afraid of being abandoned. Guilt, as painful as it may be, can seem more controllable than these primordial fears that touch the core of human vulnerability. When you can identify and face these underlying fears with compassion, you often discover that guilt was just a protective layer that can be gently removed. Patricia, a 50-year-old psychologist, told me that for a long time she felt guilty for not being able to help all her patients the way she'd like. This guilt kept her in a constant state of tension and self-judgment. But when she deepened her reflection, she discovered that behind the guilt was the terrifying fear of not being competent enough, of not deserving the trust people placed in her. When she managed to recognize and embrace this fear with compassion, she paradoxically became a more present and effective therapist, because she was no longer spending energy fighting internal ghosts. The journey to free yourself from existential guilt is, in many aspects, a journey back home to yourself. It's remembering that you didn't arrive here by accident, that your life has intrinsic value that doesn't need to be constantly proven or justified. It's recognizing that your sensitivity, which often transforms into guilt, is actually a disguised superpower. The ability to feel deeply, to connect with others' suffering, to perceive emotional nuances that others don't see. The problem was never you feeling too much. It was not having learned to protect and honor this sensitivity appropriately. When you finally manage to forgive yourself for being human, for having limitations, for not being able to save the world alone, something magical happens. You become more human, more connected, more genuinely useful to yourself and others. Your energy stops being wasted on self-criticism and becomes available for real love, real creation, real contribution. You discover you can be deeply compassionate without destroying yourself in the process, that you can care about the world without carrying its pain as a personal cross. The cure for existential guilt isn't indifference, it's conscious choice about where to place your attention and emotional energy. It's learning to distinguish between real and imaginary responsibilities, between healthy compassion and emotional masochism, between social consciousness and self-flagellation. It's deciding you have the right to occupy space in the world without constantly apologizing, that you can contribute to making the world a better place precisely because you're well with yourself, not despite it. There's a profound difference between healthy regret and toxic guilt. Healthy regret teaches you, makes you grow, moves you to concrete changes, and then leaves. Toxic guilt settles in like an emotional parasite that feeds on itself, growing more and more without ever offering anything constructive in return. When you make a real mistake, regret tells you, learn from this and do differently next time. Existential guilt tells you you are fundamentally flawed and should punish yourself eternally. Learning to recognize this difference is liberating because it allows you to maintain your moral conscience without destroying yourself in the process. Remember also that your existential guilt might be protecting you from facing deeper fears. Sometimes it's easier to feel guilty than to admit you're afraid of not being loved, afraid of not being enough, afraid of being abandoned. Guilt, as painful as it may be, can seem more controllable than these primordial fears that touch the core of human vulnerability. When you can identify and face these underlying fears with compassion, you often discover that guilt was just a protective layer that can be gently removed. Patricia, a 50-year-old psychologist, told me that for a long time she felt guilty for not being able to help all her patients the way she'd like. This guilt kept her in a constant state of tension and self-judgment. But when she deepened her reflection, she discovered that behind the guilt was the terrifying fear of not being competent enough, of not deserving the trust people placed in her. When she managed to recognize and embrace this fear with compassion, She paradoxically became a more present and effective therapist because she was no longer spending energy fighting internal ghosts. The journey to free yourself from existential guilt is, in many aspects, a journey back home to yourself. It's remembering that you didn't arrive here by accident, that your life has intrinsic value that doesn't need to be constantly proven or justified. It's recognizing that your sensitivity, which often transforms into guilt, is actually a disguised superpower, the ability to feel deeply, to connect with others' suffering, to perceive emotional nuances that others don't see. The problem was never you feeling too much. It was not having learned to protect and honor this sensitivity appropriately. When you finally manage to forgive yourself for being human, for having limitations, for not being able to save the world alone, something magical happens. You become more human, more connected, more genuinely useful to yourself and others. Your energy stops being wasted on self-criticism and becomes available for real love, real creation, real contribution. You discover you can be deeply compassionate without destroying yourself in the process, that you can care about the world without carrying its pain as a personal cross. Franz Kafka wrote his most beautiful words in moments when he managed, even if briefly, to make peace with his own existence. His most touching letters aren't those full of self-criticism, but those where he manages to look at himself with a bit of tenderness, where he recognizes his humanity without judgment. And you, who are here seeking to understand this very human pain, who had the courage to look at your own guilt without hiding from it, are already on the right path. You're already doing the most important work that exists, learning to be gentle with yourself. If you've made it this far, it's because you feel there's something deeper waiting for you beyond this guilt that has been your companion for so long. You're not alone in this search for a lighter, more authentic existence. This channel exists for those who, like Kafka, understand that life's most painful questions deserve to be explored with courage and honesty, even when there are no easy answers. Every week, we create a safe space where you can pause, breathe, and rediscover that your existence doesn't need to be justified to anyone. Subscribe not just to receive notifications, but to become part of a community that believes your journey to free yourself from existential guilt is sacred and necessary. Together, we'll transform this fatigue that doesn't pass with sleep into new energy to live with less weight and more compassion for yourself. Because you deserve to wake up tomorrow feeling welcome in your own life.